be very rainy. I'm Julie Saylor from the Maryland Department, and welcome to our program, Memories of the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. Before we begin, let me tell you about a few upcoming local history programs sponsored by the Maryland Department. Our next program is From Twilight into Sunshine, LGBTQ plus history in Maryland, and that will be on Tuesday, June 20th. On Wednesday, July 19th, we'll have a talk by Makita Brotman, author of An Unexplained Death, The True Story of a Body at the Belvedere. If you're interested in receiving emails about these and other local history programs, send us a message at mdx@prattlibrary.org, and we can add you to our email list. As many of you undoubtedly know, the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange is an institution that flourished in Baltimore for over 100 years. Many of us here at the Pratt Library have fond memories of the Women's Industrial Exchange. It's the place I used to go to for fancy lunch out. I'm sure everyone here also has memories. Our guest today is Dr. Amy Rosenkrans, who has made it her work to collect these memories. Dr. Rosenkrans is a Baltimore City social studies teacher. She received her PhD from Notre Dame of Maryland University. In 2018, she was awarded the Joseph L. Arnold Prize for Outstanding Writing on Baltimore History from the Baltimore City Historical Society for her paper, The Good Work, The Franciscan Sisters of St. Mary, Mill Hill, and the African American Mission in Baltimore. She is secretary of the executive board of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, where she was one of the volunteer researchers for the Women's Suffrage Centennial Project. Her current project, Memories of the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange, strives to document the history of the institution and the people who made it a Baltimore icon. Let's welcome Dr. Amy Rosenkrans.
Thank you, Julie. Before we get started, I would like to introduce Diana Bailey, who is the Executive Director for the Maryland Women's Heritage Center.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back at the Inn at Pratt. It's been a while. And for those of you that may not know, we are just down the street in our new location at the Women's Industrial Exchange that's owned by Marian House. We're at 333 North Charles. So please set up an interview or a tour with me at any time. And we're thrilled that there's such a focus on the Women's Industrial Exchange. And so we're thrilled that Amy can be there. I was going to put out other materials, but I'll be back at the back when Amy's finished. I can answer any other questions about other exhibits and research that we're doing at the Exchange. And thanks again. And Amy, you're back.
I'm really excited to be here in the Poe Room to be talking about the the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. And many of you have been around Baltimore long enough to remember that you've walked by the front window at 333 North Charles Street. And as Diana mentioned, our new home, the Maryland Women's Center's new home, is at 333 North Charles, the old Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange. Over the next 2 months, please take a stop in because we have a fabulous window exhibit that was designed by Brittany Powell, and the history was researched by our interns from Notre Dame of Maryland University, and you'll be hearing more of that later. But the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange is a Baltimore icon, and it has been for a number of different years and for a number of different reasons. But when we talk about the Women's Industrial Exchange, we have to talk about a little bit about Baltimore history. And as we know, Baltimore has a very complicated history when it comes to things like race, when it comes to things like the Civil War. In 1861, as you can see here by one of the most famous Harper's Weekly, this idea of a female rebel in Baltimore was an everyday occurrence. And the loyalties of the women and the men in Baltimore were very much divided through the Civil War and after the Civil War. We have people on the side of the Union raising money at places like the Baltimore Sanitary Fair in 1864. But we also have the Ladies Southern Relief Association. And Baltimore Sun newspaper reports actually say that the Southern Relief Association benefits were much better attended and raised more money than the sanitary fair for the Union. So after the Civil War, we're going to see that there are a lot of women who are in some very difficult straits. And many of these women are Southern sympathizers. These are women of a genteel nature who are not able to go out to work and whose family fortunes have been decimated and devastated by the Civil War. So a group of women come together and try to come up with a way to help these women make ends meet. And these women are not without skills. These women have baking skills, cooking skills, and fine needlework skills that they're going to find are very marketable. At first, they get together into an organization called the Ladies Depository. And it was literally the idea to have a depository or some place where women could deposit their goods that they could sell and they could receive aid. And when we talk about this depository, it was formed in 1873 by some of the creme de la creme of Baltimore society. You will notice some names here like McKim, like Frick, Goldsboro. We go on and on with all of the names here. But the name that's going to be important to us for the Women's Industrial Exchange is Mrs. J. Harmon Brown. At the depository with these women, and the last known or the last mention of the depository that I was able to find was in 1873, was Mrs. J. Harmon Brown. We don't know what happened after this time period, but what we do know is that Mrs. J. Harmon Brown and some other women or ladies of Baltimore society get together in Mrs. J. Harmon Brown's parlor on Saratoga Street and decide they are going to sell their items. They're going to sell their fine needlework. They're going to sell some of their baking. They're even going to sell perhaps some of their family heirlooms, because this is what they need to make some money. They need to be able to make ends meet. Mrs. J. Harmon Brown, and it's interesting, you'll see in lots of different records that she's recorded as G. Harmon Brown. That is actually a typo that came out of a newspaper. The J was changed to G, and a lot of people are using G. It's J, my friends. And this was through genealogical research and research through the Baltimore directory, because there was no G. Harmon Brown in Baltimore City. There was only a J. Harmon Brown. So it had to be Mrs. J. Harmon Brown, and it made sense because her husband was a registrar of wills. So she's a part of this governing society of Baltimore City. So in her home, they create this little shop. Yeah. And they sell things. And pretty soon, they outgrow her parlor. And by 1880, we have the foundation of the Women's Industrial Exchange of Baltimore. And oh my gosh, people, the verbiage, the words that are used in so many of these different things, the history that we find is fascinating and wonderful. And originally, just like the depository was, and just like the other industrial exchanges that were created throughout the country, it was for women of refinement who were in straitened circumstances. It's these women, it was not proper for them to go out to work, but they needed some way to make ends meet. But by 1880, we're going to see there's a slight shift in their mission. Now they're going to start including women of the poorer classes to be a part of the industrial exchange. By 1882, they incorporate with the Maryland General Assembly. And I forgot to tell you, the reason that we even started with this research was because when we moved into the Women's Industrial Exchange, there was a room of stuff. And being a history nerd, Diana said to me, "There's a room of stuff up here." So I'm like, okay. So when I was going through the stuff in the room, there was just files and files and piles of stuff. This document and the original incorporation papers was in one of the folders. And you can see here again, the verbiage is wonderful. The purpose of endeavoring by sympathy and practical aid to encourage and help needy women. That's interesting in and of itself. But what's even more interesting is the fact that these women incorporated with the Maryland General Assembly. And as you can see up here, they incorporated with their first names. And everything else that we're going to see through newspaper reports, through documents actually from the actual industrial exchange, it's always Mrs. M.N. Perry or Mrs. whatever. In this case, these women chose to use their first name on legal documents that were created by the Maryland General Assembly. They are going to run the institution, and just like we saw with the depository, again, these women are the upper echelons of Baltimore society. What's interesting, though, is that this is a non-denominational group of women. Usually we see throughout history that this is a Catholic association, this is a Quaker association, this is a Protestant. These women will come from all different denominations. We will have Catholic women, we will have Protestant women, we will have Quaker women, we will even have Jewish women. And this is one of the things that makes the Women's Industrial Exchange so unique. And again, you're going to see some of the famous names. Mrs. G.T. Hopkins is Mrs. Gerald Hopkins, who is Johns Hopkins' aunt. Mrs. John Stewart is going to be the mother of one of the women who were the owners of Hampton Plantation, the Tysons, the Marshalls. Other early supporters will be Mary Elizabeth Garrett, Ellen Latrobe, wife of Mayor Ferdinand Latrobe. Yes. Other Hopkins family members, in addition to Mrs. Gerard T. Hopkins, who we just mentioned, there will be Margaret Janney Elliott, who's Mrs. Joseph. There's Jane Janney White. So cousins, aunts, uncles of Johns Hopkins will be a huge part of this institution. The King family is going to also be incredibly represented. Again, we know Bessie King was Mary Elizabeth Garrett's good friend and one of our favorite suffragists from Baltimore City, and Mary King Carey, as well as her sister. So the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange is really going to be a family affair. It's going to be a family affair for women who are on the board. It's going to be a family affair for the people that work there, and we're going to see that soon. Now, something that was really interesting that I found at the Maryland Center for History and Culture when I was looking for annual reports, there aren't a lot of existent annual reports. We found out recently that there was a flood in the Industrial Exchange building that destroyed a lot of records. So what we're trying to do is find those records again. And a few of those records are at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And Mrs. John Stewart, Leonice Josephine's, her scrapbooks are at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And she has pasted into her scrapbook one of the annual reports. And it's really hard to see. And I haven't had a lot of time. This is not something I should give it to my interns. They're really good at transcribing. You'll see here, Mrs. John Stewart was originally one of the vice presidents of the Women's Industrial Exchange. But you'll see there are little X's. And the little note in the middle tells us, she explains, it's really hard to read, but she says that she resigns from the Women's Industrial Exchange. And I'm not able to figure this quite out yet. I'm still looking. But you can see that next to the names of some of the other women is the word cabal. So it is my inference so far that there was a little bit of infighting going on in the Women's Industrial Exchange, and Mrs. Stewart decides to resign, as well as the other two with X's by their names. So this is something for further research if anyone wants to take on who these cabal and what the gossip was that was going on. You will see. Mrs. John Stewart is there. She is the middle woman, or the second woman down. This picture is actually taken at Hampton Mansion somewhere. Now, with all women's charities, there's always a male advisory board. I've not been able to find much evidence that the males actually did anything. At least this advisory board, it appears that they allow their women to get on with things and do what they wanted to do. But again, a lot of times these male advisory board, they are the husbands, the wives, the sons of the lady managers. And again, they're also people like Francis White, who is Johns Hopkins' uncle, his nieces, his nephews, etc. So again, it's the same families that are connecting to work with the Women's Industrial Exchange. By 1887, they move into their current building, their building that they're going to have for life, our current building at 333 North Charles Street. This building is going to go back earlier into the early 1800s. It will have served as a number of different things, including, you can see in the back there, as a boarding house, and have different lives until the Women's Industrial Exchange moves into it. By this time, with this new building, we have a new president, Mrs. Nellie Schley Fisher. For you who are knowledgeable about Frederick history, the Schleys, or Schleys, I believe the Frederick people told me, was a very prominent family. She's going to be in charge, and she's going to be quite important throughout Baltimore and Maryland history for a number of years. You're also going to see a new name popping up as a recording secretary, Mrs. Abell, and we'll see her. She's going to be taking the reins as president in about 10 years. But in 1905, we found an original, again, in one of those piles, in one of those boxes, an original letter from President Fisher that talks about the work of the exchange. And one of my interns, which, by the way, all of them can read cursive, which is not the norm these days, it transcribed this letter, and she found quite interesting things where Mrs. Fisher was talking about all of the work that was happening at the Women's Industrial Exchange. She talks about the consigners. She talks about the fact that they are renting out apartments, that there's a lunchroom, that there's a sewing department, there's a fancy department, there's a house department, and more importantly, they're trying to figure out a way to pay off this new building. And she talks about the fact that it's a huge enterprise. They've got it figured out. They have it systematized. The women have committees. Different women are in charge of different committees, and they are getting the work done. One of the things that we talk about, and this is really hard to see, and I'll have this on our website later, there are rules in order to be a consigner. Consigners at this time, over the history of the exchange, they get between 65 and 90% of the entire price of the items or goods that are consigned. That's huge. That is huge. But there are a lot of rules. And one of the big rules is that the materials, whether it be the items or the baked goods, they have to be up to snuff. They have to meet the standards of the Women's Industrial Exchange. And what some of the women are going to start to say, and we're going to see in this letter, is that not all of the items that women are bringing are making it up to their level. So, being there to help women, we're going to see that they start having classes. And upstairs on the second and third floor, there are going to be office and class space where women learn how to do certain things. They learn how to do fancy needlework. The brand new sewing machines at the time, and a sewing machine company will donate an entire room full of sewing machines and have classes upstairs to teach the women how to use those sewing machines. There will be cooking classes. You'll see here that in addition to the sock monkeys that we think about, or the fine needlework or smocking that happened, there was an entire bakery area as well as jams and jellies. You could buy almost anything that you wanted at the Women's Industrial Exchange. They also would have to-go packs in 1888 that you could pick up and take on the train with you or the trolley car to wherever you wanted to go of lunches. As I mentioned, there are classes like a wood carving school, because it's not just the smocking, it's all sorts of different items that you're able to buy at the exchange. By 1903, they're going to report that they have approximately 600 consigners that are making at least part of their income from what they're selling at the Women's Industrial Exchange. They will go on to say that there's about 100 women that make their entire income from selling things at the exchange. Now, because the Women's Industrial Exchange only takes 10 to 20%, depending on the year, out of the consignment, they have to find a way to support what's going on. They have to pay the rent. They have to pay the gas and electric. They have to pay all of those different things. So we're going to see throughout their history are a number of different fundraisers that the Women's Industrial Exchange will have. One of which is Juliet Corson. And if you know anything about cooking and cookbooks, Juliet Corson from the late 1880s was a woman that was trying to teach women on a budget how to cook in a healthy manner. So they would have courses where women could come and take cooking classes with her. They would also sell the cookbooks that she made. But there were also performances at various places throughout Baltimore to raise money. A really fascinating group that I'd never heard of before this was called the Paint and Powder Club. which was a troupe of male actors that performed, and they solely performed to raise money for different organizations throughout Baltimore City. And there will be a number of different times that they will perform for the benefit of the Women's Industrial Exchange. Sometimes it will be at local theaters, Baltimore City, but in others, Baltimore City people had to go out on the trolley or the train to Chateau Lennay, I think that's how I pronounce it, Chateau Lennay Hotel, which was an upper crust kind of little hotel out in the Green Spring Valley where people would go to take the waters. And they would also have performance there. So lots of different ways to raise money for this exchange because they have to pay off their bills, they have to pay off the building, and they have to pay their yearly bills. One woman who's going to be incredibly important and incredibly successful in raising money will be board president Elizabeth Abell. She will be married to the son of the Baltimore Sun publisher, Mr. Abell. You will also see some other names there that might be important. But by 1917, they're really in dire straits, and they have to figure out a way to pay their bills. But more importantly, they have to be able to renovate the building. Because by 1917, things need to come up to code. We have different things going on. Elizabeth Abell will lead an entire fundraiser to renovate the building, and she will be incredibly successful in doing that. She will be recognized for that by the Women's Industrial Exchange because there's a second floor conference room at 333 North Charles that was dedicated and called the Abell Room because of her hard work. They will publish, and you can find it here in the Maryland Room at the Pratt, the 1917 catalog, which is basically a thank you note to all the people that donated to them. It's lots of different pages. There are pictures of what the exchange looked like in 1917. You can see there the ladies' lunchroom. There will be ads from people all across Baltimore City, and then there will be lists and lists of the names of the people who donated to this project. But as we have been researching, and whenever we research and we talk about anything, it's always the waitresses that people talk about. The Women's Industrial Exchange is an icon, and honestly, I think the reason that it's iconic really is because of the waitresses. There are a number of different waitresses, and in this project, we've been doing biographies of these women. One of probably the most iconic of the icons would be Margaret Shertle. She's the one that was in Sleepless in Seattle. She will work at the Women's Industrial Exchange forever, and she will become a lead waitress. We have read some interviews with her where she talks about being in charge and making sure that things happen the right way. We've talked with a former waitress, and that is indeed Miss Margaret. Now, she in an interview in 2002, she had just had to be forcibly retired because she'd hurt her foot. She had tripped over the foot of another waitress. And in this interview, believe you me, I don't think I would want to have been that other waitress that she tripped over her foot. In this interview, she says, I don't know what I'd do with myself. A couple of years prior to that, she says, I don't know what I'd do with myself if I didn't work here. And 3 years later, we have this oral history where she's sitting at home trying to figure out a way to get back because that was her life. She had lived there. Interestingly, when we talk about this being a family affair, her sister will also work at the exchange. Her twin sister will work at the exchange. Both women, the women will marry brothers, and they will live next door to each other for most of their lives. So it's a fascinating story of these two sisters. But we have another set of sisters that we have been researching. Carrie Garrity and her sister Loretta will also be waitresses at the exchange. And it's really interesting. We can go into the obituaries and learn about these women because their obituaries are extensive and they talk about their role at the Women's Industrial Exchange. This is Carrie. This is her sister Loretta. And these women will talk about the fact, they worked there for 50, 60 years, these women. This is their life. And like Loretta says, where else could we have a great job as this? We've been really lucky on this project to work with who those waitresses called the baby. Lane Bosserman has dropped by a few times and has been working with us, and she tells us fascinating stories about how the exchange worked in the late 1990s. We hear about the fact that even in the 1990s, the restaurant was not mechanized, and you wrote your little order out and it put on a string and it went up, and there was a dumbwaiter where the food came down. Everything, as we're going to see a little bit, was what the waitresses and the members of the consignment shop say was very old fashioned. But as we talk to and we look at and listen to the oral histories, that's what people liked about the Women's Industrial Exchange, that it was old fashioned, that it was old Baltimore. They went there because they wanted a taste of old Baltimore, some of which were on the various menus. Now, when you went to old Baltimore, and we listened to some oral histories of a number of different people, they talked about the fact that the Women's Industrial Exchange tea room was one of the only places that you could still get some of that old Baltimore food, where you could get kidney stew, where you could get shad roe. But more importantly, a lot of people went because they wanted things like chicken salad and tomato aspic. Now, we found a couple of different menus, and in 1961, the chicken salad and tomato aspic platter was $1.65, which was very affordable in 1961. And that's another reason why people went to the Women's Industrial Exchange, because it was an affordable lunch. If we were to take that $1.61 into today's money, that would have been about $10.50. Still very affordable. Still very affordable. These recipes were iconic. There were dessert recipes that you went and got your certain desserts at the Industrial Exchange. Lane Bosserman tells us about the fact that there were certain desserts that you would call ahead and say, is it lemon meringue pie day? If it was lemon meringue pie day, you would reserve your lemon meringue pie before you showed up at the exchange. And if you hadn't called to reserve your lemon meringue pie, you were out of luck, because you couldn't just walk in and get it, because that was one of the desserts that was so beloved by the people that came to the exchange. Those foods were made by a number of different women and men, and just like the waitresses, the cooks and the people in the kitchen would last and work there for years upon years upon years. Lydia Wright is one of them. There's a fantastic article that says Lydia won't share any recipes. She would not share any recipes. She's well known for making a chocolate syrup that you would have on your ice cream. Just like what we hear with the waitresses and what we hear with people that visited Industrial Exchange, people were nice. It was family. We wanted to be there. She will work there for over 50 years. By the 1970s, we'll see in the minutes that she retires by 1976. And the board, the Lady Board of Managers, will reward her with a beautiful engraved gold necklace. She will be assisted and will be followed up by George Madden. George Madden will be a cook at the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange, but much like the waitresses and some of the other cooks, he arrives in a kind of a circuitous nature to the Women's Industrial Exchange. He started his career working on the dining cars for the B&O Railroad. Then he went to the Belvedere Hotel, and then he made his way to the Women's Industrial Exchange. You can see there on the left, that's Miss Lydia with him, and he will talk about the recipes and the fact that he's working with people that have lived there for decades. But then at the end of the Women's Industrial Exchange, one of the most beloved cooks is Miss Dorothea. And we can see here, Miss Dorothea, in all of the articles, you can see she shows up at 5 a.m. and she gets started. And on the left, she's making her famous crab cakes. On the right, you can see those lemon meringue pies. But she is doing most of this work by herself. In one of the articles, she says she's a one-person assembly line doing all of the work. We can see throughout the minutes how beloved she is. The ladies are paying her salary. They're giving her maternity leave. They're giving her vacation leave. Miss Dorothea was famous for her recipes, and all the recipes actually were very famous at the Industrial Exchange. They had a lot of standards, and it was standards not just for the bakery items that you would buy and not just for the items in the consignment shop. There was no jarred mayonnaise. You had homemade mayonnaise that went into the chicken salad. They would also talk about all of the baked goods. You only used real butter. And even the consigners for the bakery could only use real butter. So during the time of the Depression, during the time of World War II, their consigners, they talk about going and getting their little ration stamps, to going to various different places, getting the butter so that they could make their items. There was also a little bit of a controversy during World War I over the item that were sold in the lunchroom, because in letter to the editor, they weren't sure that the Women's Industrial Exchange were observing Wheatless Wednesday. And a letter to the editor in response to that said, these women are doing everything they can to support each other and support you. I'm sure it's fine. I don't know. But all of those different recipes are much beloved and iconic in Baltimore history. Another really interesting thing that not a lot of people know about is that there was a downstairs lunchroom at the Women's Industrial Exchange. And at that lunch counter that was downstairs, there was a group of men that started meeting in we're not sure yet, we're still trying to figure out, called the Down Under Club. This picture is from 1965. A number of different people would join the Down Under Club. This was a group where men who worked downtown came together and sat at the counter and ate lunch. We talked to a number of different people, including one of their waitresses, about what they talked about. And what we hear is they didn't talk politics. They didn't get into any of that stuff because these men were from all different persuasions and religions and walks of life. They came to enjoy the atmosphere of a good old Baltimore institution. They were a place where people would, oh, did you need a lawyer? Let me tell you who you need to talk to. Oh, do you need where can you get the best straw hat? Well, these men would be able to tell you where to do that or where to go. They had 3 main waitresses, one of which was Miss Phyllis Sanders. And in the minutes, it's hilarious because as Miss Phyllis started getting a little older and she wasn't as capable of waiting on the men got really irritated when someone other than Miss Phyllis would wait on them. And so they wouldn't let anyone else wait on them. And in the minutes, it says, oh, we need somebody as backup. Miss Phyllis was still the waitress, but there was a backup that was there to help her. One of those people that will eventually be accepted by the Down Under Club, Margaret Brogna, and we're also going to know that the baby, Lane Bosserman, will wait on them as well. Now, what's really interesting, this wasn't just a club in name only. Like sometimes people say, we're this club or that club. This club had membership cards. And membership cards, in order to be a member, Miss Phyllis had to sign off on you. We were really, really lucky in the project that we're doing, this outreach. Someone heard about what we were doing, and that was Judith Rusick. And she contacted us to tell us that she was one of the 3 card-carrying female members of the Down Under Club. And this is her card we're looking at here. And she talked a lot about this camaraderie amongst the men and how she kind of gained her entrance into that male society. So this is the kind of information that we're finding that has never been recorded before. Now, as a way to make money, the entire building above the first floor was full of studios and apartments. So the women had to rent the apartments. And as early as 1887, we're going to see that they're renting out the apartments. In some ways, in some places we've seen it's been considered a boarding house, but in others, they're just called apartments. So we haven't been quite able to figure things out. What we do know, and this was an original rental agreement from the time period, that some of the employees would live upstairs. So one of the managers, Ella, of the consignment shop, Ella T. Wright, this is her rental agreement. So we know that she could just literally walk down the steps to get to work. One of her responsibilities was to take care of those apartments, so it made sense. Now, in the minutes, what's really interesting in the 1970s minutes is we really see a lot about who rented out those apartments. And one of the things that the interns found was this mention of a woman named Christy Berglund. And that name kind of started popping out a number of different places because the treasurer of the Women's Industrial Exchange also had the last name of Berglund. So one of the interns did a Google search and found that Christy Berglund found her online. And through some of the other minutes, we noted that Christy Berglund was a student at MICA. And we're going to find through these minutes and then discussion and interviews with Christy Berglund is that she rented out a studio on the 5th floor, and she's also going to rent an apartment there. She is the daughter and granddaughter of members of the Lady Board of Managers. And in addition to having a studio, she's going to waitress there for a little bit of time. But more importantly, well, maybe not more importantly, but more interestingly to us, she also does a number of portraits of the people from the exchange. So we see Miss Lydia is here on the left. This is a beautiful, beautiful picture of Miss Lydia. And then on the right is something we haven't touched on yet, and one of the things that many of the people that went to the exchange talk about. This genteel nature of the Women's Industrial Exchange, of the tea room, included a doorman. The doorman was there to open the door for you, to help you up the steps, and one of those doormen was Clifford Tongue. And Christy was able to capture him. Mrs. Orphan on the left was a bookkeeper for a number of years for the Women's Industrial Exchange. And Miss Willie here on the right. Miss Willie was a fascinating character that we're really diving deep into who Miss Willie was. She was with the exchange for decades as well. And Christy Berglund is allowing us to use these pictures as a way to advertise for the exchange. Not advertise, but you know what I mean. Now, Miss Willie, as we saw in that previous picture, she spent a lot of time at the bakery counter. But one of the things that she also did was that she researched who was going to be at the local theaters. She would go through the newspapers to see who was coming to the Mechanic or the Lyric or whatever theater was around, and she would send notes to all of the people in those performances and invite them to Women's Industrial Exchange. And the Industrial Exchange had a sign-in book where people that came, no matter who you were, would sign in. In one of the drawers, I found those sign-in books, and Miss Willie would often make notes about who came. One of the people that came a number of different times was Katharine Hepburn. It was mentioned in a couple of different Baltimore Sun articles about her coming, and we were able to find in the sign-in book where she signed in. Now, Miss Hepburn came not only to perform at the local theaters, she also came because she had a Baltimore connection. Her mother was a Houghton, and her aunt, Mrs. Houghton Hooker, Edith Houghton Hooker, lived here in Baltimore. Edith Houghton Hooker was one of the first graduates of Johns Hopkins Medical School. She was also one of the leading suffragists here in Maryland. That was her aunt. So she would oftentimes come just to visit family. And she would come a number of different times. And on one day in 1977, this was earmarked with a little red ribbon that said this was a good day. Katharine Hepburn came again, and she would send back a thank you note, thanking the ladies for the generous cookie hearts that they had given her. She's just one of many different people that we have recorded as having been at the exchange. Wallace Warfield Simpson, John Waters, to name just a few. And lots of local politicians and media people would always be at the Industrial Exchange, and we're still diving deep into those people and getting their stories as well. One of our favorite senators, Barbara Mikulski, we did an oral history with her where she talked about the fact that when she worked for Catholic Charities, she would come to the Women's Industrial Exchange for lunch. But once she becomes senator, she's going to become one of the biggest advocates for the Women's Industrial Exchange. By the year 2000, the Women's Industrial Exchange is really on hard times. The building is, the last renovation had basically been in 1917 with that one that we talked about with Mrs. Abell, and it really needed to be renovated. And the capital campaign that took place with the leadership of Senator Mikulski and the fact that they were able to get federal grants allowed the exchange to continue on for a number of different years and be renovated. She talks about the fact that she believes that the Women's Industrial Exchange is super important to Baltimore history. She talks about the fact this is an institution of women helping women. Now, something that we haven't gone too deep into yet with our research, and we're hoping to hear from some of you out there, is the consignment shop. This is a picture of the consignment shop, and it doesn't really look that different today. Consignment shop, as I mentioned, was a place where women who needed to make some money would take their goods. Now, something else that's super interesting that we haven't started investigating too much lately, but the exchange was run by female managers. And in a retail setting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was not a field that women could really go into. All of the department stores, even if you were if you worked at the counter, you could work at the counter as a woman, but you could not manage the retail establishments. So having female managers at the Women's Industrial Exchange consignment shop was a really good way for women to start breaking into that field. One of those women we know here is Gail Walter from the 1960s and 70s. And you can see here in both pictures, one of the things that the Industrial Exchange was famous for was the quilts. You can see here, and this is what I find really interesting, these two pictures go with a quote that I found in one of the Baltimore Sun articles from Gail Walters that says, "We're very old-fashioned." Well, you can see on the left, that's the picture from 1917. And on the right, that's the picture from 1971. Not much changed. And when you come to visit us at the Women's Heritage Center, you will see that we still have those original checkerboard floors, and we're still using those showcases for items at the Heritage Center, among other things. Now, we've done a lot of research in the 6 months. I've been really lucky to have volunteer researchers and interns who've been very interested, but there are a lot of things that we've not been able to touch and that we're going to need some help on researching. One thing that's super fascinating, and it goes back to this idea that Baltimore has complicated history, right? Is the fact that the Baltimore Industrial Exchange was a segregated institution, just like the rest of Baltimore City. And we were lucky enough to have on, with help from the Baltimore National Heritage Area, something that no one had known before, to my knowledge, that there's a colored women's exchange. So we are going to be starting soon on research into where that was and who those people were and how it came to be and what happened there. So if you're interested, we'd love to have your help in doing this research. And really, friends, this goes back, all the research that we're doing goes to the idea that we are gathering resources, gathering stories, we're gathering artifacts from people in the community. Do you have something in your attic? Do you have a sock monkey that you bought? Did you have a christening that you bought at the Women's Exchange and used for your family for generations? We've heard that's the case in some places. Did you come and eat lunch at the Women's Industrial Exchange? What was your favorite menu item? We'd love to hear from you because we're working to document this history of this important icon. We could also use some help with our exhibits. I'm plugging volunteers, my friend. And we're working to also start thinking about simulating some of the same types of classes that occurred at the Women's Industrial Exchange, whether it be cooking classes, whether it be crafts classes, etc. So we're always looking for someone who wants to help do that or have some other ideas. I would be remiss if I did not thank you to the people who have been helping this out. This is an entirely volunteer effort. I'm leading it up, but That's just me as my part-time job. So I've had 3 fabulous interns from Notre Dame of Maryland University. And we've also had volunteer researchers from the community from all over the state who've been helping do some of this research too. So I want to make sure that they are recognized. And I'd love to add your names to the list. Once again, thank you. We have lots of stories that I haven't shared that we'd love to share with you, and we'd like to hear more. Please contact me. And all of this has been possible through a grant from the Baltimore National Heritage Area. And we would also need to mention the Marion House at the Women's Exchange, because without them, we wouldn't have a home. So again, I want to thank you very, very much. And I'd love to hear questions that you might have. Anyone have any questions? Any questions or comments? Yes. What is the one thing that I would like to find? Well, I didn't put a picture here, but one of my bucket list items was the uniform. And we did find a uniform. It was quite the day that we found the uniform. There's lots of screaming and hollering that could be heard all through the Women's Industrial Exchange building. I would love to find the white over part, the apron part that would go on the uniform, but I really. So Mrs. Orphan and Miss Lydia, when they retired, they received engraved pendants. I would love to be able to get in touch with the descendants to see. I don't want to keep anything, but I'd love to see what those pendants look like. I think that would be really cool, as well as any other annual reports that are out there. Yes. Do we know if the Women's Exchange ever published a cookbook? We're not sure. We have been working with Kara from Old Line Plate, who is kind of like one of the cookbook authorities in Baltimore and in Maryland, and she has heard that there was one, but she's never seen it. So if it's not at the Pratt, it can't be here. Yeah. Yeah, so if anybody has a cookbook from the Women's Industrial Exchange out there, we'd love to see it. We are looking for recipes too. We had heard that when the Industrial Exchange closed, there's a recipe box with recipes in it. And we have not been able to find it. We've had people who've tried to replicate some of the recipes and have managed, they think, to do a pretty good job, but they're not quite there yet. So we would love to have some of those original recipes. So interestingly enough, the Inns did a fantastic job when they were doing their oral histories, and they discovered through one of their oral histories that Miss Dorothea, the last cook in Women's Industrial Exchange, is still cooking in Baltimore City, and you can still get the Baltimore Women's Industrial Exchange chicken pot pies at David Dad's. So if you've ever been to David and Dad's, I think it used to be pot pie day on Thursdays when I worked down here. That was a Women's Industrial Exchange recipe by Miss Dorothea. Yes. So we are in the process of doing oral histories with as many people as we can find. Right now, we have about a dozen oral histories that we've recorded. Some have been on Zoom because there are still some people who are not comfortable with being in public. So we have some on Zoom, and then others we've recorded ourselves. Our intent is to put them online. One of the goals of this project is to create an online exhibit of the history of what we've done. We also are looking to find a partner who will be the home for all of the physical objects that we've found, because there are quite a few things that we found that need to be archived in the right way. So we're going to have an online exhibit. but we also need to find some place to house all of these items. Hint, hint, hint. The Maryland room would be a beautiful place for them to live. Yes. So we haven't gotten into the closing history yet, but from preliminary research, as you mentioned, it's money. The tea room was what supported the entire. Even at the end of the time, by the 2000s, the consignment shop was still only taking about 20% of the profit from the consignment. The rents were not that high in the apartments, and the tea room was just losing money. And that it was losing money basically because by the 90s and 2000s, downtown Baltimore had changed. The tea room, all through most of its existence, up through even the 50s and 60s, was a place where ladies who lunched. And by the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you don't have a lot of ladies who lunch left anymore. And the tenor of Baltimore City downtown had also changed. And a lot of people, even though they had their diehards and their people that would come every day, they were getting older, and your younger whippersnapper people did not value the tea room and what it had to offer. We like to think that today, with a lot of the retro things, that we'd love to rethink that again, that the Women's Industrial Exchange, if we could find a good entrepreneur out there, or a food truck, as some people have said, would love to bring that back, because with all the retro nature of things happening, that it could maybe come back. But we don't have the capacity to do that. We would like a partner to do that. Another partner. But yeah, it boils down to money with everything. Sure. So if you are to come and visit us at 333 North Charles Street, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, you will see lots of different things that are on display. As I mentioned, our window for this month and June are items from the Women's Industrial Exchange with a uniform, with menu, a facsimile of the Katharine Hepburn letter. But you can also visit us to learn more about Women's Heritage Center in general and the history of Maryland women. We have an exhibit on the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame, and we also have several exhibits on women in STEM and women suffragists from across Maryland. So we would love to have you join us, and you can check us out on the web at www.marylandmen'sheritagecenter.org. So the hours are by appointment, so reach out to us by appointment. We do private tours and would love to have you there. So thanks a lot. Thank you, guys.